10 books that have shaken the world. The Bible. The Bible is a collection of religious texts or scriptures. The word Bible is derived from the Greek words ta biblia, which means the books. This book is a compilation of texts of various forms written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek languages. These texts include religious and ethical instructions, stories, poetry, prophecies, and the history of Jews. The Bible is divided into two parts. One is called the Old Testament, and the second part is called the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Christian name of the original Hebrew Bible. Christianity added the New Testament, and now both parts are collectively called the Christian Bible, or only the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is divided into three parts. One part is called the Torah, which consists of 5 books. It details the creation of the universe, including the world and all living beings. It starts with Adam and Eve and ends with Moses. The second part consists of prophets called Nevi'im or prophets. The third division is called Ketuvim, or writings. The New Testament tells us the story of Jesus Christ, his companions, and their teachings. This book has wielded immense influence over people for more than 2 millennia. It has impacted the history of religions as the Bible introduced the concept of the oneness of God, which wiped out polytheism in Mesopotamia, Greece, Egypt, and the Middle Eastern countries. Secondly, it gave rise to Christianity. Around 2 billion people profess Christianity. The Hebrew Bible introduced the concept of the Messiah. Later on, Jesus claimed to be the promised Messiah and founded Christianity, which contributed to the fall of the ancient Roman Empire, which later adopted Christian beliefs. This book's story of Adam and Eve is believed by a majority of people in this world even today. The concept of evil Satan also sprang up from this book, which is known all over the world. God and Satan are the 2 most known figures in human history. Both concepts came from this book. This book introduced several prophets and other towering personalities and their works, like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Ishaq, Joseph, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, David, Solomon, and Jesus Christ to the world. The legendary global flood phenomenon called Noah's flood was also introduced by this book to the vast majority of people. During the period of colonialism, all European countries held Christian beliefs, and colonized every nook and cranny of the world. They introduced biblical teachings to every continent of the world, from Asia to Latin America to Africa and Australia, and thus converted a large number of people to Christianity. Currently, the majority of countries in the world are Christian due to the Bible. The Quran. The Quran is the sacred religious text of Islam. Muslims hold the belief that the text was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad directly from God through the angel Gabriel, called Jibril in Islam, who brought the text orally to the Prophet Muhammad. It was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad for 23 years from 610 to 632 AD. In 610, Muhammad was declared prophet by God, and in 632, he died in Medina. The Quran has 114 chapters called surah, which consist of individual verses called ayat. Besides its religious significance, it is widely regarded as the finest work in Arabic literature and has significantly influenced the Arabic language. Muslims believe in the Quran as a divine text providing a complete code of conduct across all facets of life, including personal life as well as political, social, economic, judicial, and other areas of human activity. This is the only book in history that is claimed and believed to be entirely divine, and no man has written or added a single word or letter to it. This book has added certain new things to the religious history of mankind. It introduced 1/40th share of wealth as zakat every year to the national kitty for the poor and needy. It introduced every year a congregation of Muslims from all over the world in Mecca to perform Hajj and make sacrifices of certain animals. It is one of the largest congregations of people all over the world. It also introduced the concept of jihad, which means fighting for the cause of God or Islam. It also introduced the distribution of a fixed amount of booty of war, 80% share to the fighters and 20% share for God, the Prophet, the needy, and orphans. Islam encourages people to free their slaves, but it does not clearly forbid it. In subsequent Muslim rule in various regions, slavery was openly practiced. Islam advocates the cutting of hands for thieves, killing for murder, stoning for adulterers, and death for blasphemers. According to Islam, all teachings, commands, and instructions of the Quran are eternal, and no mortal has the authority to change even a word or letter in it. No law can be made against any teachings of the Quran in Muslim countries. Arabs followed the teachings of the Quran, and in a short period, they were transformed from a warring tribal society to a formidable force that conquered several countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. They toppled the Iranian kingdom, which stood for more than 1,000 years, wrested territories from the Byzantine Empire, defeated Egypt and conquered India. In a few decades, Islam spread to 3 continents, namely Asia, Africa and Europe. Currently, there are around 57 Muslim countries in the world where the majority of people are Muslims. Besides, there are millions of Muslims in other countries too. In India, there are around 200 million Muslims, and in China, their number is around 11 million, who also follow Islam by adopting the teachings of the Quran. Today, around 1.5 billion Muslims follow the Quran, and their lives are governed by its instructions. Avesta. The Avesta is the primary collection of religious texts of Zoroastrianism, composed in the Avestan language. The Avesta texts fall into several different categories, arranged either by dialect or by usage. Zoroastrianism combines a dualistic cosmology of good and evil with an eschatology predicting the ultimate triumph of Ahura Mazda over evil. It originated probably in the 2nd millennium BC, called the Avestan period, and served for more than a millennium between 600 BC and 650 AD as the official religion of the ancient Iranian empires, beginning roughly around the time of the Achaemenid Empire and formally coming to an end with the Muslim conquest of Persia in 636 AD. This religion has impacted the world to a greater extent. This was the first religion to introduce the concept of dualist gods called Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. Ahura Mazda is the creator deity and the supreme god in Zoroastrianism. He is the beginning and the end, the creator of everything that can and cannot be seen, the eternal and uncreated, the all-good, and the source of Asha, meaning truth or the right path. He is assisted by a league of countless divinities called Yazatas, meaning worthy of worship. He has an opposing force called Ingramenu, or Ahriman. While Ahura Mazda created the universe and mankind, Ingramenu, whose very nature is to destroy, created demons, evil devas, and noxious creatures such as snakes, ants, and flies. Ingramenu created an opposite, evil being for each good being, except for humans, which he found he could not match. Thus, in Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda and Ingramenu compete for human beings to bring them to their respective sides. This religion, through its book Avesta, influenced Judaism after Cyrus the Great defeated Babylon in 539 BC. He ordered the construction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem. By interacting with Zoroastrianism, the Jews knew about the evil entity Ingramenu, who was an opposing force to Ahura Mazda and tempted people to his side. This led to the creation of evil Satan in Judaism during the silent period of 400 years, the period between the ministry of Malachi and the advent of John the Baptist. During this period, no new book or new prophet came to the Jews. Thus, Today's world is indebted to Zoroastrianism for the introduction of the evil Satan, which first appeared in Judaism's teachings and later in Christianity and Islam. This book also introduced the concepts of heaven called the House of Songs and hell called the House of Lies in Judaism and Christianity. Before, no such concept was contained in the Hebrew Bible. The concept of weighing good and bad deeds to judge people's piety also came from the book of Avesta. It also provided the resurrection of the dead, Judgment Day, and accountability based on deeds, which were later adopted by all Abrahamic religions. This book's features still influence billions of people around the world. The Rigveda. The Vedic religion was prevalent amongst the Indo-Aryan peoples of the northwest Indian subcontinent during the Vedic period from 1500 to 500 BC. This religion was based on Vedic texts that contained religious traditions and teachings that originated in ancient India. These teachings have shaped Hinduism. The Vedic texts are composed in Vedic Sanskrit, the oldest scripture in India. There are 4 Vedas: the Rigveda, the Yajurveda, the Samaveda, and the Atharvaveda. The Vedas have been orally transmitted since the 2nd millennium BC with the help of elaborate mnemonic techniques. One of these 4 sacred canonical texts, the Rigveda, describes the institution of the caste system and reinforces the idea that lifestyles, occupations, ritual statuses, and social statuses are inherited. In Vedic religion, Purusha was a cosmic being, and by sacrificing him, the gods created all life. Rigveda says that the Purusha was divided into 4 portions: the Brahman was his mouth, the Rajanya or Kshatriyas came from his arms, the Vaishya were formed from his thighs, and the Sudra were produced from his feet. The Brahmins were responsible for the performance of the religious work. The Kshatriyas, or warriors, were expected to protect society from internal and external harm. The Vaishyas were the trading people who also took care of agricultural production, and the Sudras were to serve the other 3 classes and were known as the servant class. By around 1000 BC, the Indo-Aryans developed 4 main caste distinctions: Brahmin, consisting of priests, scholars, and teachers; Kshatriyas, the kings, governors, and warriors; Vaishyas, comprising agriculturists, artisans, and merchants; and Sudras, the service providers and artisans who were originally non-Aryans but were admitted to Vedic society. Each class was divided into jatis, or subcastes, which identified the individual's occupation and imposed marriage restrictions. Marriage was only possible between members of the same class or closer jatis in the same class. Both classes and jatis determine a person's purity level. According to the caste system, members of the higher class, like Brahmins, have higher purity levels, and if contaminated by members of lower social groups, even by touch, they would have to undergo extensive cleansing rites. The Sudras have the lowest level of purity. As the Aryans expanded their influence, newly conquered groups were assimilated into society by forming a new group below the Sudras, outside the caste system. These outcasts were called untouchables or Dalits, as they performed the least desirable activities and jobs, such as dealing with dead bodies, cleaning toilets and washrooms, and tanning and dyeing leather. More than 160 million people in India are considered untouchables, tainted by their birth into a caste system that deems them impure and less than human. They are not allowed to drink from the same well, attend the same temples, wear shoes in the presence of an upper caste, drink tea from the same cup, or drink water from the same glass. They live in constant fear of being humiliated, paraded naked, beaten, and raped with impunity by upper caste Hindus seeking to keep them in place. During the Muslim era, spanning from the 11th century to the mid-19th century, many Sudras and Dalits accepted Islam to obtain equal treatment. The same happened during the British Raj period, as several Sudras and Dalits accepted Christianity to save themselves from the upper caste Hindus. The implications of the caste system, which originated from the Rigveda and has survived for over 2 millennia, haunt even today's India, as the presence of over 200 million Muslims and 22 million Christians has polarized Indian society and led to communal discord. This is all the result of the teachings of the Rigveda. Although the Constitution of India formally abolished the caste system in 1950, most people still enforce the caste system in their lives. The incoherence of the philosophers. Tahafut al-Falasifa, or The Incoherence of the Philosophers in English, is an 11th century work by the Muslim polymath al-Ghazali criticizing the Avicennian school of early Islamic philosophy. Muslim philosophers such as Ibn Sina or Avicenna in Europe and Al-Farabi or Al-Farabius in Europe are denounced in this book, as they follow Greek philosophy even when, in the author's perception, it contradicts Islam. The book was extremely popular among the religious circles of the time. The book favors faith over philosophy in matters specifically concerning metaphysics or knowledge of the divine. The book is organized into 20 chapters, in which al-Ghazali attempts to refute Avicenna's doctrines. He states that Avicenna and his followers have erred on 17 points by committing heresy. He addresses each point in a separate chapter. In the last 3 chapters of the book, he accuses them of being utterly irreligious. Among the charges that he levels against the philosophers are their inability to prove the existence of God and their inability to prove the impossibility of the existence of 2 gods. This book refutes the relationship between cause and effect, which is the foundation of science and every phenomenon. Ghazali supported occasionalism, which is a philosophical doctrine about causation that says that created substances cannot be efficient causes of events. Instead, all events are taken to be caused directly by God. This philosophy changed the scientific paradigm of Islam's golden era when science was studied and developed by various scientists and scholars. Now scientists were no longer required to explain different natural phenomena or any social, political events. Now reign was given to religious leaders to interpret various phenomena by citing relevant religious texts. This theory was welcomed by the Muslim rulers, as now they were absolved of any misrule or bad governance. If famine occurred under their rule, it could be explained that it was the work of God who wanted to punish people for their sins, not due to the poor planning of the rulers. If an epidemic erupted, it was again the work of God, and human beings had no control over it. They also got support from religious leaders for their remaining in power because it was God who gave them the power to rule the people, whether they performed or not. The religious leaders also supported their dynastic rules on the same principle that everything is the work of God. In return, these religious leaders got a free hand to reclaim their lost glory in Muslim society. They suppressed renowned scientists, and turned centers of learning and universities into religious seminaries. Slowly and gradually, religious leaders got hold of the masses, and finally, they disconnected Muslim from science or rational thinking. A few scientists tried to put up resistance against Ghazali's work. Among them was a noted polymath Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in Europe, who wrote a refutation of al-Ghazali's work entitled Tahafut al-Tahafut, meaning the incoherence of the incoherence, in English, in which he defended the doctrines of the philosophers and criticized al-Ghazali's own arguments. He was severely punished and later exiled, and his books were banned and burned. The same treatment was meted out to other rational thinking minds of that time, and all were forced into silence. This one book threw billions of Muslims into the abyss of darkness and ignorance. This book's influence is still palpable even after the passage of more than 900 years. In Muslim countries, religious leaders still have a dominant position, and they stifle rational thinking based on reason, citing the sacred text of the Quran and other religious literature of Islam. No one can dare challenge them, as the ruling elite always sides with them in the suppression of progressive thinking people. This is the reason for intellectual bankruptcy among Muslims today all over the world, largely thanks to Imam Ghazali's book Incoherence of Philosophers, which was patronized by Muslim rulers for their vested interests by aligning themselves with religious leaders and suppressing free thinking and inquiry. On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres is a seminal work that was written by Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus. The book was a compendium of 6 books published in Germany in 1543, the year of the death of Copernicus. This book presents the heliocentric theory. Though the heliocentrism theory was conceived earlier by several people, the oldest dating back as far as the 3rd century BC, but it was lost in time, and the world had accepted and adopted Ptolemy's geocentric system, which had been in use since ancient times. The geocentric model, also known as geocentrism or the Ptolemaic system, accepted a superseded description of the universe with Earth at the center and the Sun, Moon, stars, and planets all orbiting around the Earth. The geocentric model was the predominant description of the cosmos in many European ancient civilizations, such as those of Aristotle in classical Greece and Ptolemy in Roman Egypt, as well as during the Islamic Golden Age. 2 observations supported the idea that Earth was the center of the universe. First, from anywhere on Earth, the Sun appears to revolve around Earth once per day. Second, Earth seems to be unmoving from the perspective of an earthbound observer. It feels solid, stable, and stationary. The Copernican heliocentrism model positioned the Sun at the center of the universe, motionless, with Earth and the other planets orbiting around it in circular paths, modified by epicycles, and at uniform speeds. When Copernicus' compendium was published, it contained an anonymous preface by the Lutheran theologian Andreas Osiander, who was a friend of Copernicus. This cleric stated that Copernicus wrote his heliocentric account of the Earth's movement as a mathematical hypothesis, not as an account that contained truth or even probability. Since Copernicus' hypothesis contradicted the account of the Sun's movement around the Earth as given in the biblical book Joshua, this preface was apparently written to soften any religious backlash against the book. Verses 12 and 13 of chapter 10 of the biblical book Joshua mention that when the Amorites' nation fell to Israel, Joshua ordered the sun to stand still over the Gibeon area and the moon over the valley of Ajalon till Israel finished the Amorites. Therefore, following the order of Joshua, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down for about a full day. When the book was published, it faced opposition from Christian theologians, including Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant movement in Christianity, who wrote, "People gave ear to an upstart astrologer who strove to show that the earth revolves, not the heavens or the firmament, the sun and the moon. This fool wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy, but sacred scripture tells us in chapter 10 and verses 12 and 13 in the book Joshua that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, and not the earth." It was inconceivable for the Christian theologians that the earth was just a planet orbiting around the sun, as they believed that earth was the center of the universe, and that is why Jesus was sent to the earth. This book was placed on the index of forbidden books by a decree of the Vatican on March 5, 1616, more than 70 years after the publication of Copernicus' book. It remained on the index until 1758. This book opened the way for rationale research, which helped loosen the grip of Christianity over science and other walks of life by showing them their inconsistencies. Finally, the Renaissance in Europe gave the final blow to the stranglehold of religion over Europe, and science, reason, and inquiry became triumphant. The Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto is one of the world's most influential political documents. It was a political pamphlet written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and published in London in 1848. The text put forward a new theory called historical materialism, which says that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. This book explains that social classes are defined by the relationship of people to the means of production. The book was published amid the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, which took place over the course of more than 1 year, from 1848 to 1849. The revolutions were essentially democratic and liberal in nature, with the aim of removing the old monarchical structures and creating independent nation-states. Over 50 countries were affected. These revolutions were quickly suppressed, as tens of thousands of people were killed, and even more were forced into exile. The text of the Communist Manifesto outlines the relationship between the means of production, the forces of production, and the mode of production, posits that changes in society's means of production affect changes in its superstructure, and mentions that capitalism is marked by the exploitation of the proletariat, meaning factory labor, by the ruling bourgeoisie, meaning capitalists and factory owners. The manifesto concludes that capitalism does not offer humanity the possibility of self-realization, instead ensuring that humans are perpetually stunted and alienated. It theorizes that capitalism will bring about its own destruction by polarizing and unifying the proletariat, and it predicts that a revolution will lead to the emergence of communism, a classless society. The manifesto proposes the abolition of private property, nationalization communication, and transport, expansion and integration of industry and agriculture, enforcement of universal obligations of labor, provision of universal education, and the abolition of child labor. The text ends with a decisive and famous call for solidarity, popularized as the slogan, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." This book inspired people in every nook and cranny of the world. It led to the establishment of Russia as the first communist state in history in 1917, with the name of the Union of Soviets and Socialist Republics, USSR. It was followed by communism in East European countries such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, and former East Germany. Thereafter, communism spread to China, Mongolia, Laos, Cambodia, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and South Yemen. This book's philosophy initiated several communist and socialist movements in various countries and changed the world and people's lives. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an American writer who wrote an anti-slavery novel entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was published in 2 volumes in 1852. The novel had a profound effect on attitudes towards African Americans and slavery in the U.S., and is said to have helped lay the groundwork for the American Civil War. Stowe, a Connecticut-born woman of English descent, was religiously inclined and also an active abolitionist person. In the United States, abolitionism, the movement that sought to end slavery in the country, was active from the colonial era until the American Civil War, the end of which brought about the abolition of American slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a sentimental novel to depict the reality of slavery. The novel focuses on the character of Uncle Tom, a long-suffering black slave around whom the stories of the other characters revolve. She wrote the novel as a response to the passage of the Second Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. This act was passed by the 31st United States Congress on 18 September 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850 between Southern interests in slavery and Northern free soilers. The act was one of the most controversial elements of the 1850 Compromise and heightened Northern fears of the perceived political power held by American slave owners in the federal government of the United States. It required that all escaped slaves, upon capture, be returned to the enslaver and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate. The act contributed to the growing polarization of the country over the issue of slavery. It was one of the factors that led to the American Civil War. In the United States, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel and the second best-selling book of the 19th century, following the Bible. It is credited with helping fuel the abolitionist cause in the 1850s. The influence attributed to the book was so great that a story is always mentioned. Abraham Lincoln met Stowe at the start of the Civil War and remarked, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." Uncle Tom's Cabin sold equally well in Britain. The first London edition appeared in May 1852 and sold 200,000 copies. In a few years, over 1.5 million copies of the book were in circulation in Britain. By 1857, the novel had been translated into 20 languages. Translator Lin Shu published the first Chinese translation in 1901, which was also the first American novel translated into that language. On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species was written by Charles Darwin, and it is considered to be the foundation of evolutionary biology. It was published in November 1859. Darwin's book introduced the scientific theory that populations evolve throughout generations through a process of natural selection. The book presented a body of evidence that the diversity of life arose from common descent through a branching pattern of evolution. Darwin included evidence that he had collected on the Beagle expedition in the 1830s and his subsequent findings from research, correspondence, and experimentation. The book was written for non-specialist readers and attracted widespread interest upon its publication. Darwin was an acclaimed scientist, so his findings were taken seriously, and the evidence he presented generated scientific, philosophical, and religious discussion. 2 decades after the publication of the book, there was widespread scientific agreement that evolution, with a branching pattern of common descent, had occurred, but scientists were slow to give natural selection theory the significance that Darwin thought appropriate. From the 1880s to 930s, various other mechanisms of evolution were given more credit than Darwinism. With the development of modern evolutionary synthesis in the 930s and 940s, Darwin's concept of evolutionary adaptation through natural selection became central to modern evolutionary theory, and it has now become the unifying concept of the life sciences. The modern evolutionary synthesis combined the ideas of Darwin's natural selection, Mendelian's genetics, and population genetics. Darwin's theory of evolution can be summarized as follows. Every species is fertile enough that if all offspring had survived to reproduce, the population would have grown exponentially. Despite periodic fluctuations, populations have remained roughly the same size as resources such as food are limited, but they are relatively stable over time, which means the population is within limits. A struggle for survival occurs in species, and those who cannot survive perish. Individuals in a population vary significantly from one another due to genetic inheritance. Individuals less suited to the environment are less likely to survive and less likely to reproduce. Individuals more suited to the environment are more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce and leave their heritable traits to future generations, which produces the process of natural selection. While Darwin had been somewhat coy about human origin, not identifying any explicit conclusion on the matter in his book, he had dropped enough hints about humans' animal ancestry from the apes, which conflicted with the religious narrative of biblical Adam and Eve's ancestry. Natural selection also conflicted with the religious narrative of purpose in nature. Finally, science became triumphant, and science abandoned the biblical genesis of human beings through Adam and Eve in favor of the evolution of different species including mankind. Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, or My Struggle in English, was a German book that was published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926, respectively. It was written by German leader Adolf Hitler in 1925 as an autobiographical work that also contained his political thoughts, which later came to be known as the Manifesto of the Nazi Party. This book describes the process by which Hitler became anti-Semitic, and he outlines his political ideology and future plans for Germany. Hitler began writing Mein Kampf while he was a prisoner following his failed coup in Munich in November 1923 and a trial in February 1924 for high treason, in which he received a sentence of 5 years. Hitler hoped the book would be published in many editions, thus enabling him to fulfill his financial obligations and defray the expenses incurred at the time of his trial. After a slow start, the book became a bestseller in Germany following Hitler's rise to power in 1933. After Hitler's death, the copyright of Mein Kampf passed to the state government of Bavaria due to his residence in Munich. It refused to allow any copying or printing of the book in Germany. In 2016, following the expiry of the copyright held by the Bavarian state government, Mein Kampf was republished in Germany for the first time since 1945 in 2 volumes with almost 2,000 pages annotated with about 3,500 notes, which prompted public debate and divided reactions from people, especially Jewish groups. It was sold within hours on Amazon's German site. In Mein Kampf, Hitler used the main thesis of the Jewish peril, which posits a Jewish conspiracy to gain world leadership. The narrative describes the process by which he became increasingly anti-Semitic and militaristic, especially during his years in Vienna. Mein Kampf has also been studied as a work on political theory, as in this book Hitler airs his hatred of what he believed to be the world's 2 evils, communism and Judaism. It was a very critical period in Germany's political history, as it had suffered a devastating defeat in the First World War, and Allied forces had put crippling political and financial cost on Germany. The German people, as a whole, were under severe strain and despair. In the book, Hitler blamed Germany's chief woes on the Jews, Parliament, Social Democrats, and Communists. He believed that Communists, Social Democrats, and the Parliament were all working for Jewish interests. He announced that he wanted to destroy the parliamentary system completely, believing it to be corrupt in principle, and termed political leaders as inherent opportunists. This book mentions Hitler's personal grievances and his ambitions to create a new order. In this book, Hitler supported the destruction of the weak and sick to provide the proper space and purity for the strong. He also wrote against other races, such as Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Serbs, Croats, and other nationalities. He called the Russians an inferior race. Mein Kampf, in essence, laid the ideological foundation for the Holocaust, by identifying the Jews and Bolsheviks as racially and ideologically inferior and threatening, and the Aryans and National Socialists as racially superior and politically progressive. Hitler's revolutionary goals included the expulsion of the Jews from Greater Germany and the unification of German peoples into one Greater Germany. Hitler desired to restore German lands to their greatest historical extent, real or imagined. It led to World War II, which caused millions of deaths in Europe and other countries. During Hitler's years in power, the book was in high demand in libraries and was often reviewed and quoted in other publications. It was given free to every newlywed couple and every soldier fighting at the front. By 1939, it had sold 5.2 million copies in 11 languages. By the end of the war, about 10 million copies of the book had been sold or distributed in Germany.